So the encounter with Jesus that we're looking at today, once again, is recorded in Matthew's gospel as well as Mark's gospel. You spent some time reflecting on them. They were read out loud. Mark 15, 21 through 28 is the primary text that we're going to look at today. And we're just going to spend some time talking about this encounter with Jesus. I'm going to start with verse 21 of Matthew 15. It says, "Leaving that place, Jesus withdrew to the region of Tyre and Sidon. A Canaanite woman from that vicinity came to him crying out." So, Tyre and Sidon. This is Gentile territory. And this is a Canaanite woman. In Mark's gospel, he calls her a woman from Syrophoenicia. So this woman was living in the town of Phoenicia in the province of Syria, and she was a descendant of the Canaanites. So if you have read the Old Testament or are familiar with the Old Testament at all, you'll probably recognize that the Canaanites are pagan people. The Canaanites are enemies of the Israelite people. So why did Jesus go there? Because this was a place where most Jews would typically avoid. And I think most of us would probably know the answer to that, because if you're familiar with the Gospels, as we read through the Gospels, we see that Jesus often went to places others refused to go. He often went to places others refused to go. He often met with people that others refused to meet with. He intentionally sought out people that others tended to avoid. Tax collectors like Matthew and Zacchaeus. We looked at the story of Zacchaeus a few weeks ago. He even went to their homes. He hung out with them in their homes. That was a big no-no for a Jewish man, Jewish rabbi. He went out of his way to go through the Samaritan, to meet the Samaritan woman at the well. We've talked about that story before. That was a really big no-no. He wasn't supposed to do that. A few weeks ago, we looked at the encounter where he touched the leper. He touched unclean lepers. These were people and places to avoid, but not Jesus. And this is a really big deal. There's a point to Jesus going there to encounter this Canaanite woman. There's a point to this. And as we're going to see later on in the story, this becomes a turning point in Jesus' ministry. Let's keep reading. So a Canaanite woman from that vicinity came to him crying out, "Lord, Son of David, have mercy on me. My daughter is demon-possessed and suffering terribly." She calls him Son of David. Son of David is a messianic title. She's saying, Jesus, you are the Jewish Messiah. You're the Jewish Messiah. That really is a big deal. Now, 2 chapters earlier in the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 13, we read that Jesus went to his hometown. He spent some time in Nazareth, his hometown of Nazareth, and the people in Nazareth, the people in his hometown, took offense at Jesus. And Jesus said, "I'm a prophet without honor, even in my own hometown." And he didn't do any miracles in his hometown because of their lack of faith. The next chapter in Matthew, chapter 14, is the story of Jesus walking on the water. He comes walking on the water, and the disciples are frightened, but then Peter steps out of the boat and begins walking towards Jesus, and then he begins to doubt, and he sinks, and Jesus reaches his hand and saves Peter and pulls him up and says, "Peter, why are you doubting? You've got such little faith." So here we have the Israelite people, the people of God, who are really struggling. They're struggling to believe that Jesus is who he says he is. But now there's a Gentile, a Canaanite woman who recognizes who Jesus is. Recognizes that Jesus is the Jewish Messiah. He's Lord. He's King. She calls him the Son of David. You're the Messiah. You're the King of Israel. You're Master. You're Lord. Do you see how incredible that is? What a big deal that would have been? Lord, Son of David, have mercy on me. My daughter is demon-possessed and suffering terribly. Jesus did not answer a word. So his disciples came to him and urged him, send her away, for she keeps crying out after us. So Jesus ignores her. Jesus doesn't even answer her, and that should seem strange to us, right? We'll come back to that in a second. The disciples say, Jesus, just send her away. She's getting on our nerves. She's bugging us. She won't stop. Just send her away, Jesus. And here's the thing. That's what religion often does. And I think most of us would recognize that. That's what religion often does. Religion tends to exclude people. Religion tends to push people away because of who they are and what they've done. Because religion is based on merit. It's based on worth or worthiness. And it tends to exclude people. But the way of Jesus is inclusive. It draws people in. Once again, let me remind you that Jesus went where no one else would go. And he included people that no one would even consider to include. That's the way of Jesus. But why did Jesus ignore her at first? And why did he say what he says next? Send her away, the disciples said. She keeps crying out. And he answered, I was sent only to the lost sheep of Israel. The woman came and knelt before him. She was very persistent. Lord, help me, she said. He replied, it is not right to take the children's bread and toss it to the dogs. He's calling her a dog? Very strange, right? Is Jesus being unkind? Is Jesus being rude? Is he being cruel? It seems that way, doesn't it? Like when we just read it, it seems that way to us. Just reading it in our language and in our context, it seems that Jesus is being rude. He's being cruel to her. But here's a couple of things that we need to think about. First of all, he's already called the people of Israel lost sheep. He just called them lost sheep. And in their context, and probably in our context as well, that's just as bad, if not worse, right? We also need to understand that the word for dog that Jesus uses here is not the word for wild dog. It's not the word that Jews would typically use when referring to Gentiles, because Jews would call Gentiles dogs, and Jesus isn't using the same word. Jesus is actually using a different word. It's the word for little dog or pet dog. But still seems rude, right? But once again, we have to keep in mind who Jesus is. And we should know better if we're familiar with Jesus and his teaching, what he taught, what he modeled, who Jesus is. I mean, just a few chapters earlier in Matthew, we read the Sermon on the Mount where Jesus taught to love your enemies. We know that God is love. We know that Jesus is the embodiment of love. The Apostle Paul gives us a definition of love. The Apostle Paul says love is patient with people and love is kind towards people and love doesn't dishonor people. So Jesus is not being unkind. He's not being rude. There must be something else happening here that we just don't quite understand from our perspective, reading it in our language, from our context. And besides, Jesus has already been healing non-Jewish people. He's already healed a Roman centurion's paralyzed servant. And he even praised that centurion for having such great faith. He said, I haven't seen such great faith in all of Israel. He's praising a Roman soldier, and the Romans are the ultimate enemies of the Israelite people. So what's going on here with this woman? Here's what I think is happening. I think Jesus is drawing the woman in. He's drawing her in because of her persistence and because of her faith. And he knows that she believes. He knows that she has faith. And he's building tension. I think when we read it, we understand the tension and we can feel the tension. He's building tension and he's causing a little bit of a stir amongst the disciples, amongst the crowd of people. And he's doing it to make a point. To make a point. But this is what's incredible. he's not the one actually making the point. He's actually allowing this Gentile, this Canaanite woman, to make the point. He's allowing her to teach a very important lesson to his disciples, to the people of Israel, and even to us, if you think about it, 2,000 years later. I mean, think about that. Here's the lesson. Jesus came first and foremost to the people of Israel, the children of Israel. Jesus was laser focused on that mission. He came to do what they could never be and do. He came to faithfully fulfill the covenant made with Abraham, which they failed to do. He was the blessing for the Israelite people. He was their Messiah, their final king, the ultimate provision of manna for them, the bread from heaven that they desperately needed. But they had forgotten that that blessing wasn't supposed to end with them. It was a blessing that was always intended to flow through them to all the nations of the world, to all people. He replied, "It's not right to take the children's bread and toss it to the dogs." "Yes, it is, Lord," she said. How audacious of her. "Yes, it is, Lord. Even the dogs eat the crumbs that fall from their master's table." Then Jesus said to her, "Woman, you have great faith. Your request is granted," and her daughter was healed at that very moment. As God said to Abraham way back in the Old Testament, all the peoples of the earth will be blessed through you. And this has always been God's goal. And Jesus used the persistence and the faith of this Canaanite woman to remind them of what they had forgotten, to remind us what we often forget, that his gospel is an inclusive gospel. His kingdom is an inclusive kingdom. And in his kingdom, there is more than enough bread. There's more than enough bread to go around. There's bread for everyone. And this woman, and this is so important, this woman becomes a turning point, a hinge in Jesus' ministry. Because in the very next verses, this is the very next verses, right after this happened, we're going to read, I want to continue to read verse 29. Jesus left there and went along the Sea of Galilee. Then he went up on a mountainside and sat down. Great crowds came to him, bringing the lame, the blind, the crippled, the mute, and many others, and laid them at his feet, and he healed them. The people were amazed when they saw the mute speaking, the crippled made well, the lame walking, and the blind seeing, and they praised the God of Israel. This is Gentile territory still. And they're praising the God of Israel. But there's more. Let's keep reading. Very next verse, Jesus called his disciples to him and said, "I have compassion for these people." That's a big deal. I mean, remember the disciples wanted him to send her away. Send this Canaanite woman away. What's she talking about? Jesus says, "I have compassion for these people. They have already been with me 3 days and have nothing to eat. I do not want to send them away hungry, or they may collapse on the way." His disciples answered, "Where could we get enough bread in this remote place to feed such a crowd?" "How many loaves do you have?" Jesus asked. 7, they replied, "and a few small fish." He told the crowd to sit down on the ground. He took the 7 loaves and the fish, and when he had given thanks, he broke them and gave them to his disciples, and they in turn to the people. They all ate and were satisfied. Afterward, the disciples picked up 7 basketfuls of broken pieces that were left over. So in the previous chapter of Matthew 14, we read about Jesus feeding another crowd. Just the previous chapter, he feeds 5,000. That was an Israelite crowd. Now this is a different feeding, just a chapter later. This is a Gentile crowd, a non-Jewish crowd. So with the first feeding, with the Israelite people, does anybody remember how many basketfuls were left over? I mean, he fed the crowd miraculously, multiplied the loaves and fishes, and there were 12 basketfuls left over. Because that was an Israelite crowd. The number 12 represents the people of Israel. His provision for Israel. 12 basketfuls. The 12 tribes. Now in the feeding here, how many baskets are left over? 7. So what might that be representing? Because we've talked about this before, the numbers in the Bible are significant. They represent something. They're used to make a significant point. And many scholars believe that this would have pointed Jewish readers back to Deuteronomy. Old Testament, Deuteronomy, chapter 7. And in Deuteronomy, the Israelite people are on the verge of entering the promised land. And they're going to enter the promised land by mercilessly conquering the Canaanites. You see the connection here? Deuteronomy 7 verse 1 says, "When the Lord your God brings you into the land you are entering to possess and drives out before you many nations," let's count them, the Hittites, Girgashites, Amorites, Canaanites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites, 7 nations larger and stronger than you. And now, here's Jesus doing ministry among those people. Here's Jesus having compassion on them, having mercy on them, healing their lame, their blind, the crippled, the mute, and he's feeding them. He's providing bread for them. And they're praising the God of Israel. What's happening? I'm reading a book right now called The Starfish and the Spirit, and it's by Lance Ford and Rob Wagner. And I'm reading this book. It has nothing to do with this sermon series that we're in. It has nothing to do with this encounter with Jesus. It's a discipleship book that I'm required to read for the denomination because I'm a part of a discipleship group that meets weekly via Zoom with the pastors across the country. So it's required reading for our denomination. I have to read it. We meet weekly on a Zoom call, and we meet actually with Rob Wagner, one of the authors of this book. He meets with us. And I just happen to be reading, not preparing for this. And the book actually refers to this story. And so I'm just going to quote from the book because the authors make the point better than I ever could. They kind of sum this whole thing up. They say this: "Now, instead of a Jew conquering a Canaanite with no mercy, we have a Canaanite woman conquering a Jewish man who surrenders an act of mercy." And once again, this is the turning point of Jesus' ministry. The authors continue, Jesus takes the old destroy the Canaanite story and turns it on its head. He takes the no mercy policy and instead shows mercy to a Canaanite woman. 7 nations were to be destroyed. Jesus leaves 7 basketfuls to feed them. Instead of heading out with swords and spears, we are to head out with bread and fish to serve and heal. And now you can understand why many Jewish people failed to believe. Because they were looking for a completely different kind of Messiah, completely different kind of king. The number 7 represents completion. And so with Jesus' ministry to the Gentiles, the blessing to Israel and through Israel to the nations was being accomplished. I want to read verse 29 and 30 again. Jesus left there and went along the Sea of Galilee. Then he went up on a mountainside and sat down. Great crowds came to him, bringing the lame, the blind, the crippled, the mute, and many others, and laid them at his feet, and he healed them. All these people were laid at Jesus' feet, Gentile people. This reminds me of Revelation chapter 4 and 5, and we studied Revelation a few months back. And I really think that there's an intentional connection here. I can't prove it. But in Revelation chapter 4, we see all the creatures, all of creation praising God around the throne. I don't know if you'll remember that if you were here. All of creation, all these creatures praising God around the throne. Let me read it, Revelation 4, 9 through 11. "Whenever the living creatures give honor, glory, and thanks to him who sits on the throne and who lives forever and ever, the 24 elders fall down before him who sits on the throne and worship him who lives forever and ever. They lay their crowns before the throne, just as the Gentiles were laid at Jesus' feet. And they say, "You are worthy, our Lord and God, to receive glory and honor and power, for you created all things, and by your will they were created and have their being." And then we turn the page to Revelation chapter 5, and we see the elders, all the elders falling down before the throne of the Lamb, singing, "You are worthy to take the scroll and to open its seals, because you were slain, and with your blood you purchased for God persons from every tribe and language and people and nation." This is what God has desired from the very beginning, and this is what Jesus came to accomplish. With Jesus, there is more than enough grace to go around. With Jesus, there's more than enough mercy to go around. There's more than enough compassion. There's more than enough bread. There's more than enough bread. His kingdom is a kingdom of abundance, and all are welcomed. And in his kingdom, all will be taken care of. I'm going to invite the worship team to come up. And as we take the Lord's Supper today, as we receive the Lord's Supper today, let's remember the sacrifice of the Lamb. The Lamb. Let's be reminded that his body was broken, and his blood was shed for me, for you, and for all the nations. For all the nations, for everyone, for the entire world. We've experienced God's blessing in such tremendous ways, and that blessing is meant to be shared. As we talk about application takeaways, I'm going to start with a couple challenging questions to kind of get us to thinking, and then I'm going to open it up. And if you have something that you want to share, maybe something that you underlined or wrote on your pages earlier, you can do that. The first question that I have is, where and to whom might following Jesus lead me, lead us? Whom might I be avoiding? Whom might I be excluding, or we excluding? Is there anyone? Are there groups of people that we've written off intentionally, maybe unintentionally? Is there anyone that I think is a lost cause? Second question. How can we demonstrate God's abundance through acts of mercy, compassion, and generosity? God's kingdom is a kingdom of abundance. In God's kingdom, there's more than enough to go around. This is our Father's world, and He owns a cattle on 1,000 hills. He owns it all. And I don't know about you, but I think sometimes we often tend to be tight-fisted, right? Holding tightly to our time, holding tightly and tight-fisted with our money and our resources, and sometimes we're even tight-fisted with in extending grace and mercy to people. And I think it's because we live in a society that has a scarcity mindset, a society that says that there's not enough to go around, and we better hold tightly to what we have. We better hoard what we have. This scarcity mindset is based on fear, and I think it's rubbed off on us sometimes. But in God's kingdom, there's more than enough bread to go around, and we're meant to share. And Jesus demonstrated through his example that it's physical bread as well as spiritual bread. We read that he had compassion. He had compassion for these people. He met their needs. He fed the crowd. But he also gave his life as the bread of life, spiritual bread. So as the church, as his body, as his hands and feet in the world, we are the embodiment of his kingdom. We're to demonstrate to the world what it's like when Jesus is on the throne. This is what God's kingdom is like. This is what it's like when Jesus is king. In his kingdom, all wrongs will be made right. So as his body, we point the way to that by meeting needs, physical needs as well as spiritual needs. They go hand in hand in God's kingdom. Will you stand? Pray this prayer with me. God, just like the Canaanite woman, we want to be hinges. We've been blessed in so many ways. We know that your blessing is meant to flow through us to the entire world. So God, let our doors swing wide open to our neighbors, co-workers, classmates, and even our enemies. Amen.